All right, it is 8:03 p.m. Thank you everyone for joining on your Sunday evening. My name is Kevin, I'm your presenter, and this is the U Ottawa Med Interview Seminar. Insights from me, a top 10 U.S. medical student, accepted both Canadian and U.S. MD. So let's get on with it. Today we're focused on the panel preparation and the interview days. So the Bright Doctor, as an organization, we have sessions on the Casper, on a lot of different things. So if you want access to those, please give us an email and we will gladly send them to you. Okay, and we have exclusive content today just for you, Ottawa. So if you've been to our previous seminars, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, there's even more cool stuff for you today to check out. And a little bit about me, I'm a first-year medical student at the Mayo Clinic. I've been accepted to both Canadian and US medical schools. In fact, the first time I applied, I only applied to Canadian medical schools. And I got two interviews. McMaster in Ottawa, actually, believe it or not. And I got waitlisted at both and then rejected from both. The second time I applied, I got 9 interviews, 4 in Canada, across provinces, 5 in the US, and I got into both Canadian and US medical schools. Right now I'm at the Mayo Clinic, which is the #1 hospital on the face of the planet. And, I chose the US path. If you have questions, by the way, about international medical school, feel free to ask me that at the end. Now, the focus of today's presentation is, what is the difference between great answers and extraordinary answers? Okay, and I'll tell you why this is so important. Now, your interview, it's a panel. I mean, you should know this. You got an interview. If this is the first time you're seeing this, I mean, I'd be concerned. But I imagine everyone knows what their interview is going to be like. So I'm not going to bore you with the format, but feel free to ask me questions anyways. Now, for your Ottawa interview, some people think, okay, it's a panel interview. I'm going to prepare for this in a radically different way than I'm going to prepare for my MMIs. And this is simply not true. In my panel interviews, consistently, I've been asked health policy questions, ethics questions, personal questions, just like those MMIs. I think the difference with the MMI is just the innovation is in that you have a different interviewer for every station, so it's like less bias or something. I think that's the whole innovation there. But of course, there's differences. Like you could be asked, tell me about yourself. You're not going to get that in an MMI. You're going to get that in a panel. So panels might even be harder because you're going to prepare MMI style, and then you're going to have to prepare for those personal questions you could be asked because the person, one of those 3 people across the screen wants to know a little bit more about you. Okay, so pay attention to these hot topics. You need to not only understand facts and have knowledge on all these topics, but you need to be able to craft expert opinions on all of these topics. So not only are you going to be like, oh, medical assistance in dying in Canada, cool. In 2021, the laws were changed to include non-terminal illnesses. You can mention that, but you need to be able to not only know the facts, but have an expert opinion on these subjects. These are all medical related subjects. And here's the thing. I told you when I started, I told you at the beginning of this presentation, I interviewed twice with Canadian medical schools. The first time I got waitlisted and rejected. The second time I got in to Canadian medical schools. What was the difference? The first time, all these topics, I was able to provide expert answers and opinions on them. So what was the big difference? Here's the thing. I would go into a panel, a Canadian panel, right? I'm not going to say which one because NDAs. So I'm going to keep it anonymous. But I'd go and they'd ask me a question about cancel culture, right? They asked me a question about the wealth gap. They asked me a question about housing in Ontario, climate change. And I'm like, man, I just got a question on cancel culture. And I've spent the last 2 months studying like organ donation, right? So I would be completely thrown off by these questions that seemingly have nothing to do with medicine. And what it comes down to is, as a future medical student, as the cream of the crop, you're the 1%, 2% that get into medical school, you're expected to have an opinion on everything in society, because if something affects people in society, like housing, then it actually becomes a question of public health. And public health is a huge theme in medical school interviews, across North America, right? US, Canadian, I've done both, different provinces, different states. Public health is a theme. So that's why you could get a question on wealth gap. I've been in Canadian interviews where they've shown me a graph of the world and different wealth distributions across the world. And they just said, interpret this graph and what do you think of it, right? So fully weird things like, is war good or bad? And you can use these and make sure to have opinions on these matters, opinions on like cancel culture or whatever the hot topics are of today. whether they're medical related or not. Okay. So now I believe the best way to learn is always through practice. So we're going to do a question together. Imagine you are a physician and you encounter a patient with chronic pain who requests opioid medication. How would you balance the need for effective pain management with the risk of opioid addiction? So I'll give y'all 1 minute, not 1 minute, 10 seconds to think, how would you answer this question? And by the way, we're going to send you these slides at the end, so you don't have to like take notes. So let's look at an answer. Let's look at an answer to this question. You could say, I would conduct a comprehensive assessment of the patient's pain. You know, what's your pain like? What's from 1 to 10? How much does it hurt? Does it radiate? Et cetera, kind of like your normal physical exam workup. I would have open conversations with the patient about their pain experience and treatment history. Okay, let me understand more about the patient. If opioids are necessary, I would proceed with caution, starting at the lowest dose to avoid dependence. I would revise the treatment plan with the patient periodically, which means I'd regularly review it and adjust as needed. And lastly, you could give a conclusion. So this is an answer, obviously, to the question we just asked. Can someone tell me, is this a good answer or not? Unmute or just put in the chat, is this a good answer to this question? And I promise you, I will not go to the next slide until one person either unmutes or puts in the chat yes or no.
No.
All right. Kamal Deep says no. You know what? I'm not going to probe you, but I'm going to be honest, Kamal Deep. I think this is a good answer. This is a good answer. I mean, this is you're right. You are right. But this is still a good answer. And I'll tell you why. This is the sort of answer I would have given in my first time I interviewed, right? I would give like this. This is a pretty mature answer that hits all the points of the question. It's something even a clinician could say, right? You could, if you saw this, you're like, oh, maybe a clinician said this, you wouldn't doubt it. And I would be like, man, why did I get waitlisted and rejected from all my interviews? But now let's look at this. Let's look at what else we could have said in our answer, okay? So this is me the first year up top, and this is me the second year interviewing, where I got in, Canadian, US schools, at the Mayo Clinic now. Imagine we also said, I could first explore a multidisciplinary approach to treating pain. For instance, physiotherapy, lifestyle modifications, exercise, or diet. I would educate the patient about the risks of opioid use and how we can minimize these risks to build a trusting doctor-patient relationship. Now, what if we went even further? What if we made connections to the opioid crisis? Every major metropolitan center across Canada, and especially here in Ontario, is dealing with an opioid crisis. You can mention that, you know, what's going on in Ottawa, what's going on in the north, in the Northern Territories, right? You could talk about sickle cell disease and racism with respect to opioids. For instance, did you know that a lot of the times when young Black men come into the ER, the emergency room, in pain, they need medication for their pain, and they have sickle cell disease. This is something that's underdiagnosed, and it's more prevalent in black individuals because the sickle cell trait confers resistance to malaria. So that's like, especially if they're coming from certain parts of the world, right? They might have this trait and they might have sickle cell disease. So they're in immense pain, but the emergency room doctor is like, oh, this person just wants opioids, right? So there's stereotypes built into that, and you could discuss that. You could discuss specific medical cases relevant to Canada or Ontario. You could briefly talk about the science of opioid addiction. Maybe you took a course on cell biology. You could talk about reuptake, norepinephrine, you know, how these opioids work and why they're so addictive, how they build tolerance. I wouldn't spend too much time on it, but you know, as a way to go beyond. You can mention your knowledge of naloxone training. Now imagine in your panel you're asked about, you know, the opioid crisis, and you're like, you know what? I have been, you know, on the streets. I have taught, I've administered naloxone, or I have run sessions to train people on how to use naloxone. Or I've been trained myself. There's so many ways to go beyond, to answer questions that are not even in the question, right? To make connections, show something about yourself. And this is how you stand out. This is how you give an extraordinary answer. And this is what I started doing the second cycle I applied and interviewed that helped me get into several schools. And I'm reading the chat. Kachadur says it's not complete. You need to take other things into consideration. Always put the cons. Yeah, you're fully right. Thank you for your comment, Kachadur. I said the name right. By the way, all of these questions we're using today come from our website, thebrightdoctor.com. This one in particular, we have question banks. This one comes from our opioid crisis question bank, along with the whole answer that you saw. Ideas to go beyond, red flags to avoid. So for instance, to go beyond, you could have also said you could advocate for the use of prescription drug monitoring programs to track opioid prescriptions, right? So Ontario and every other province has like opioid stewardship programs where they track how much opioids are being prescribed by which physicians, and they catch like red flags. Oh, this physician's prescribing too many opioids. Let's go investigate that. Okay, so there's a lot of ways. I mean, you could not only answer the question but go beyond. So why can't you just answer the question in a simple way and go on with your day, right? And sometimes you can, especially if you're a very, very great talker, very personable, very, have a great personality. But I don't like those odds. The thing is, you're interviewing. There's around 600 people being interviewed, and there's 200 spots. Okay, everyone here is deserving of that seat in the medical school. Everyone here has a stellar GPA. Okay, this is Ottawa. This is Ottawa we're talking about. You have a stellar GPA. You've done great on your Casper. You have those extracurriculars. You've taken organic chemistry, right? No one else requires organic chemistry, but you've done all of that. But the thing is, there's 599 other of you. And how are you going to stand out when everybody's giving great answers to these questions? And the way I see it is like this cartoon. So the first year I applied, I'd be one of these people. Who is this person? This is the person that is like, oh, I got an interview. Let me start reading. Let me read Doing Right. Let me listen to the C-Match podcast. Let me listen to White Coat, Black Heart. Let me go on healthydebate.ca. Let me go on cbchealth.ca. And then the thing is, like, everyone's doing that. So if you're like this person, you're probably looking ahead like, oh man, everyone's doing that. I should probably do that. And these people are probably laughing, at the beginning. They're probably laughing at him or her. But here, this is the second time I applied. I fully started going against the grain. I didn't use those resources again. Those are phenomenal resources, by the way. The thing is, if everyone's using them, then everyone's giving the same answer to the same question. And it really just comes down to who's the better talker. And I don't like those odds, okay? I don't like just who's the better talker. So I wanted to be able to have better things to say, more, hit those CanMES roles better, have more innovative things to say than others. And that made all the difference for me. So this whole presentation is about how to do that. Now, what are the 5 ways to stand out? The second time I interviewed, I figured, okay, if I distill this down to like an equation, what are the 5 ways to stand out? It's either you're going to address more perspectives than other people, right? You demonstrate more knowledge. You offer more creative alternative solutions or how to avoid something in the future. You're a better speaker. You're more personable. You have a better organized answer, less ums and ahs, and you can look at the camera and speak with confidence. For instance, if I told you right now that the average length of a giraffe's neck is 20 feet, would you believe me? I figure a lot of you would, but I just made that up. So you have to look at a camera and speak with confidence. Now, you can also make connections to your personal life, your future career, or demonstrate specific domain knowledge. This is a huge way to stand out in your answers. So, for example, to your personal life, in that opioid question, you could have talked about like naloxone training you've done, or maybe you've been in settings where opioids were common and you've done some sort of volunteering. Your future career, I'll show you like so many ways to do that over the course of the presentation. And domain-specific knowledge, this could have been talking about the science of opioids, for instance. And lastly, you explain why. So I have so many colleagues back when I was last year interviewing and the year before that would have the coolest ideas in their answers, right? Oh, I think we should create an app. Oh, Ontario should make a website for this. We can use virtual reality to have patients, experience better outcomes in this. And they would come up with the coolest ideas, right? Like virtual reality. They just wouldn't explain why. Well, why is putting a headset on your, chronic disease patient the best way to do something? And explaining why will get you a very, very long way, okay? So always explain why. Now here, this person, I call him Smart Alec. Everyone knows a Smart Alec. Smart Alec is the person in your class, guy or gal, that will speak condescendingly to people, but they always sound like they're trying to talk like they know everything, but really they don't. And here's the sad thing. Smart Alex, I've seen them get very far in this interviewing process because they can simply look at a camera and speak with confidence, okay? So now you have hundreds of people who have amazing ideas, research ideas, they're not making stuff up, but they will, say ums and ahs, they're not personable, they're not organized, and this smart aleck will beat them out. So be a smart aleck. Well, don't be one, but learn how to speak like them, how to look at a camera and speak with confidence. Now, how should you speak? Obviously, it's a panel, so it's obviously synchronous. It's a panel. What you're going to do is, if they ask you a question like, tell me about yourself, which you could very well be asked, or why do you want to be a doctor? Why do you want to go into medicine? You could very well be asked. And in my panels, I've been thrown off. I've been asked like, oh, tell me about yourself and why you want to be a doctor. So like at the same time, those two questions you want to have separate answers for. And those are maybe the longest answers you'll have prepared, 2.5, 3 minutes max. And you should also have an answer prepared for the combined scenario where they're like, oh, tell me about yourself and why you want to go into medicine. So that is that. And then if they ask you something afterwards, I really wouldn't talk for more than 2 minutes at a time. Because then, you're just starting to ramble. And it's a 40-minute interview. They've done several of them. You don't want to be talking extraneously. And should you go in depth or broad? A lot of times they're going to be asked a question. And should you, talk about a few things, but like cover them deeply, or should you talk about like 10 things and cover them at a shallow level? And my idea is I always talk about 1 or 2 things very deeply, but either at the beginning or at the very end, I acknowledge other perspectives that I might have kind of not spoken about, just so they understand that I acknowledge those perspectives, okay? All right, now let's do another practice question. If there's any questions or if you think I'm going too fast, please put them in the chat. How does the Ontario health system address the needs of Indigenous populations, and what improvements can be made? All right, I'll give you all a few seconds to think. What will your answer be? It's Ottawa. You could very well be asked like, what are your experiences in rural medicine, right? You could very well be asked like a lot of things in this realm. So let's look at this answer. Our introduction is, we're going to skip main idea. The Ontario health system has made efforts to address the unique healthcare needs of Indigenous populations, though there are still significant areas for improvement. This is a beautiful introductory sentence because it tells you very straightforward, in a very subtle way. I'm going to first talk about what the Ontario system is doing, and then I'm going to talk about the areas for improvement. Beautiful. One way the system addresses these needs is through culturally sensitive care. This involves providing healthcare services that respect and incorporate Indigenous cultural practices, beliefs, and values. For example, some healthcare facilities in Ontario have integrated traditional healing practices alongside conventional medical treatments, recognizing the importance of holistic care that encompasses physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. This is amazing. Just look what we said here. Integrated traditional healing practices, some facilities in Ontario, and then we talk about spiritual well-being. What this shows, because some people love to force their can meds into their answers, or they like to force their extracurriculars into their answers. Just by talking about, okay, this is what Ontario has, you're showing that either you've been in the hospitals, you've been volunteering, you've been in those community organizations, and you've seen what Ontario offers to this vulnerable patient population. And by talking about spiritual health, well-being, that is incredibly, vital to this answer, because other cultures, they might believe in a shaman, in more spiritual ideas of medicine and the world, right? Maybe they don't want to get a red blood cell infusion. Like, there's different things, and you have to find ways to reconcile these different aspects of medical care, especially in terms of what it means to them. And you're communicating this in your answer. The Ontario government has also made efforts to improve access to healthcare for Indigenous communities. This includes funding for programs and services specifically designed for Indigenous populations, such as the Aboriginal Health Access Centers, which offer a range of health and wellness services. Beautiful. We talk about another real-time thing that Ontario has, Aboriginal Health Access Centers that offer these services. It shows that you're knowledgeable about this patient population and their problems, and also what already exists for them. However, there are still notable gaps and challenges. One major issue is the accessibility of services, especially for those in remote or rural Indigenous communities. These areas often lack adequate healthcare facilities and professionals, leading to significant disparities in health outcomes. Beautiful. So just as we said in our introduction statement, now we're talking about the areas for improvement. Another area for improvement is the training and education of healthcare professionals in Indigenous health. While some progress has been made, there's a need for more comprehensive and mandatory training on cultural competence and the historical and social factors that impact the health of Indigenous peoples. Beautiful. Again, notice how CanMeds have been like sprinkled into these answers in a very subtle way where you're not like fully just, saying it explicitly. Now look here. Furthermore, there's a need for greater involvement of Indigenous communities in the planning and delivery of healthcare services. So in these first 4 paragraphs right here, these first 4 body paragraphs, we answered the question, what does the Ontario health system do and what improvements can be made? Now we're going to talk about something extra. We're going to go beyond. How can we solve this? This could be achieved through more meaningful partnerships and collaboration with Indigenous leaders and organizations, ensuring that healthcare initiatives are community-driven and responsive to their specific needs. So now we're saying, okay, Ontario's doing this. Here are the problems, what Ontario could still be doing, and here's a solution. Why don't we get those Indigenous community leaders? We're making laws all day that are impacting their health. Why don't we get them in the decision-making room and get their input on how best to meet their needs? That is what you're saying here. And again, we're hitting the CanMeds. Shared decision-making is a CanMeds role, right? Shared decision-making. We're not saying it explicitly, because if you did, you just sound like a robot like the other 100 people. But just through our answer, the maturity of our answer, we're communicating these values. We're saying that, okay, here are the problems. We need to get those individuals and have shared decision-making with them, have them in the room, provide their input, so we know how to address the needs of that population, okay? So in a very mature and expert way, you've not only addressed the question, but you've went above and beyond in providing a solution. So again, yeah, we demonstrate relevant knowledge of Ontario policies. We have multifaceted ways of addressing the topic, and we provide an innovative idea at the end. And then lastly, there's a conclusion. We could have even, this is our website again, we could have went beyond. We could have advocated for increased investment in healthcare infrastructure in remote Indigenous communities. Beautiful. So you could talk about like telehealth, right? A lot of the times Indigenous peoples might live very remote, far away from a hospital. They'd have to be like helicoptered to the nearest hospital that might be like 2 hours away by car, right? So you could talk about that setting. And look, red flags to avoid. Do not overlook the historical context of Indigenous health disparities, including the impact of colonization and residential schools. So colonization, forced sterilizations, residential schools, and trauma. These are all things that impact the health of Indigenous populations, and they might even create mistrust in the medical system, right? Because the medical system 100 years ago did forced sterilizations on them. You should not overlook this, and you can use these as ways to stand out. Everyone's just giving a basic, I call it a GPT answer to the question, but you're going beyond. You're talking about all these things, all these multifaceted ways to address these problems. And that's what makes a difference, okay? So this is the last, is that a question? Sorry, okay, so this is the last part. I told you we'd be quick. Are there any questions for me before we go to the next part? What should you do if your mind goes blank? So Unique, I will tell you how to be able to think on your feet very quickly, okay? For both policy, ethical questions, and even personal questions, especially with your panels. I'll tell you how to be able to think on your feet quickly very soon. All right, next. First impressions. This is my favorite thing to tell people. In a synchronous interview, hello, my name is Kevin. With whom do I have the pleasure of speaking with? You don't always see their names in the Zoom or the Kira talent. So get their names. Some of them, they might want you to use their first name, for example. They don't want you to use their last name. So remember their names, remember it, and say thank you, Dr. Locke. Thank you, Sarah, the medical student. Say it at the end, and it'll make a world of a difference when you remember their name and say it at the end. And always smile and introduce yourself. Always, okay, just like, with whom do I have the pleasure of speaking with is the best way you can get people's names, especially if it's not on the Zoom. And even if it is, you might not be able to like pronounce it correctly, right? So just ask them, like, with whom do I have the pleasure of speaking with? And they'll say, oh, my name is Dr. Locke. And now you know how to spell it. And you're not going to say Locke, right? Like a dummy. So, and let's look at personal questions, how we can answer these. This is a panel interview. You're going to be asked personal questions. And look at the CanMeds roles and have 2 to 3 questions ready for each personal type of question you could be asked, okay? Communication. This is the American list. I like the American list. But you could use CanMeds. It doesn't matter. So I would have 2 to 3 stories about my life relevant to communication, to cultural competency, to problem solving, and so on and so on. And for example, look, what is the biggest challenge you've overcome? This hits like overcoming conflict. This hits resilience. This hits capacity for improvement, probably problem solving. So your stories can be very versatile as well. Like they don't have to only hit one thing. And you could always be asked follow-up questions that are relevant. So how do you answer these personal questions? And what I use is the STAR method. Okay, STAR, situation, task, action, results. The way it works, first you describe situation. So last semester in the McMaster Bio Society, while organizing a programming skills workshop for first-year students, we encountered an unexpected vendor cancellation, leaving us without crucial materials. I was tasked with swiftly finding a replacement vendor without overshooting our budget. Cool. S&T, get that out of the way quickly. Because the first time I interviewed, what I would do is I would spend like a minute talking about the situation. Oh, I was at this lab, and then the research, my PI had this meeting on Tuesday and he couldn't make it there, so I had to do this. And I would give them so many details because obviously these are your life stories, right? They mean a lot to you. You want to put them in the setting that you were in, so they know like, oh wow, this person was like so resourceful. Look at these problem-solving skills. But here's the thing: you could be saying that you were at the Prime Minister's office curing cancer. Okay, it doesn't get you points. What gets you those points is the A and the R, the action you took, which shows your critical thinking, which shows your skills, right? How do you do things, right? Who are you? And then the results. So as quick as you can, practice your stories and practice being able to tell them quickly so you can discuss what you did. Now, obviously, this isn't like the biggest challenge someone's overcome, but it is a challenge nonetheless. So consequently, I quickly researched alternative suppliers, assessed their offerings against our needs, and strategically approached the most promising ones to renegotiate terms suitable for our budget. I use strategies like calling suppliers instead of email to ensure rapid communication. Ultimately, we secured the necessary materials under budget, and the workshop went on without a hitch, earning praise from attendees. All right, this is the STAR method, but here's the thing, and I think I invented this. If I haven't, you can please let me know. There's a missing letter, and it's the T, which stands for takeaway. And where possible, in these personal stories, I would always have a takeaway, either a personal story or relation to your future profession, and it'll make sense which one to use. So let's see. If we were to answer this, we're going to answer the same way, but now look what we did at the end. As I pursue a career in medicine, I will continue to draw on such skills to stay collected in rapidly changing situations. Through strong communication skills, along with problem solving, I will continue to ensure team needs are met for the benefit of my future patients. Beautiful. This is so beautiful because not only do you give them an answer, a very mature, organized answer to the question, right? You could be asked so many personal questions on your panel, but now you give them a takeaway. As a future physician, as a medical student, this is how these skills that I just told you about, the story, this is how they're relevant to my future. This shows that you've reflected on medicine. You've reflected on what it's like to be in medicine. And it's just a very mature addition. And here's the beauty. For all these topics, I would have a takeaway. So I could be asked a question on communication or like collaboration. And I'd say, okay, yeah, I'd say my answer. And then I'd say, as a future physician, as a future medical student, I'm going to be in multidisciplinary teams, providing team-based care, holistic care to my patients. And I'm going to have to be able to overcome conflict, for example, or see different points of view and engage and share decision making. So I would have a takeaway that I could use for any of these CanMeds roles. And it would be like 3 points at the end of my answer. It would be a very well-rehearsed line or two that just adds, that sprinkle of maturity to my answer. So have stories ready, 2 to 3 for all of these CanMeds roles that reflect your values, that perhaps tie to your future career, that hit these CanMeds items. And lastly, and no one does this, okay, I was maybe the only person doing this, because I applied to the US and US interviews before. So in the US, there's over 150 medical schools here, and top applicants will apply to 30 medical schools. They'll get interviews at 20 medical schools, and they'll get acceptances at 10 medical schools. Okay, so I know, I hate to ruin your night, but the thing is, when you have all these medical schools, they're going to ask you, why do you want to come to this medical school? And you got to have an answer for them. Okay, and in Canada, obviously, you're lucky to get a single interview. You're lucky to get a single acceptance. So often they don't ask, although I have been asked in my Canadian medical school interviews one time, why do you want to come to this medical school? So always have an answer for that. But look, research the crap out of your medical school. Look at Ottawa's, the Faculty of Medicine's website. Click all the tabs. Click all of them. What global health opportunities do they have, right? Maybe they send people to the Dominican Republic. What clinical rotation sites does Ottawa have, right? Maybe you can talk about, maybe they're going to ask you a question about rural health or telehealth, and you're going to be like, you know what? You're going to give an answer, a very great answer. And then you're going to say, by the way, I know Ottawa has clinical rotation sites that I can use in my 4th year to go to like this remote community. And I look forward to doing that as a student because that's going to help me further grow my skills in addressing the needs of this patient population. So there's so many cool ways in your answers that you can integrate a very personalized answer to that medical school that shows that, okay, this person hasn't like just been reading like Doing Right for like 10 hours a day, right? Oh, maleficence, non-maleficence, whatever. But this person researched the medical school and you can have very tailored answers to your medical school, which will help you stand out. In fact, I had that in one of my Canadian interviews where they asked me a question about antimicrobial resistance, and I gave an answer. I gave a very good answer. And then I said, by the way, your school has the premier antimicrobial resistance research laboratory in Canada. And as a medical student, I would be very interested in, using my genomics background to contribute to research in that, because I find, it's one of the top problems facing humanity right now. And you just blow them away when you have answers like that, okay? And now, unique in the chat. This one's for you. So I had a friend who had all the CanMeds roles on like flashcards in one deck, and then had all his stories in the other deck. Okay, he's at Queens now, and he would like he'd grab like a beer on a Friday night, and he'd grab up 2 at random, and he'd try to make the story connect to the CanMeds role, right? And I never did that, but I thought of that as such a cool way to be able to think on your feet, right? Have the CanMeds roles on one side on a bunch of cue cards, and then on the other side have all your personal stories, and pick up 2 at random and just see, how can you connect these? And this will make you be able to think on your feet very quickly, especially when you're asked like new novel questions. All right, rapid fire tips. This is the exclusive part of the interview, of today's webinar, just for Ottawa, because we're collaborating with 3 groups. So there's a lot of interesting topics, and here are things that I think people don't talk about on these topics. So I call it common topics, not so common ideas. Let's start. Organ donation. Opt-out versus opt-in model. Definitely talk about this. Canada's like opt-in. You got to opt in to be an organ donor. Other countries, like in the EU and stuff, it's opt-out. Like you're an organ donor automatically unless you don't want to be. Some countries like Iran have a marketplace. Okay, talk about exploitation, talk about living donors. Homelessness, you can talk about statistics. Complex housing, talk about different forms of new housing ideas, new housing developments. You can buy a house at like Costco now, at least in the US. So like the price of housing is being brought down for these like unique housing modules. So there's a lot of cool things you could be talking about. I guarantee you, and it really it makes me mad. Like people don't think outside the box. They're like, let me go on CBC Health. Oh my God, this is the best website. Wow. And they just talk about what they read there, and they sound like GPT in their answers. Read about cool things that are like novel ideas that are being applied to these age-old problems. Rehabilitation and reentry to workforce initiatives, social determinants of health. Medical assistance in dying. So you can talk about the Canadian law, the changes made in 2021, the slippery slope argument. So in 2021, they said medical assistance in dying can be expanded, not just to terminal illnesses, but beyond that. So it could be even like mental health illnesses. So you can talk about, okay, like where are we going to stop, right? Like now you're saying that some person with a mental health disorder can request medical assistance in dying, like and now maybe next is children, right? So religion, healthcare costs, autonomy. Yeah, talk about those. So Patrick asks, could there be questions about current events in recent news? Yes, Patrick, definitely. Like I'm naming all these things, doing right, CBC Health. These are great resources, and you can learn a lot from them, and you should. It's just I wouldn't rely on that as my only thing. Like if you're just looking at, oh, what are my peers doing? You know, then you're just letting it be like a dice toss if you're gonna get into medical school, because you can't be saying the same things as everybody else. But the answer to that, Patrick, is yes. And by the way, we have on our website, we have like the Ontario Health mini question banks. We have mini question banks on Ontario Health policy that offer real-time news, example answers to questions that you could be asked. Okay, I'll show you that in a second. Climate change. Talk about the effects of medicine on climate change related to Indigenous health. For example, a lot of Indigenous communities, their environment is a big part of their identity. So if like the climate ruins, you know, their environment, then they lose that, and it affects their health. Synthetic biology. I urge you to look that up yourselves. I'm not even going to bother, but here's that's a golden nugget from today's webinar. Go look that up. Clean tech, education, research, vaccine ethics. Talk about the COVID-19 response, obviously the truck protests, the Emergencies Act. So there was a lot of things recently, whether it was allowed, it was constitutional or not. Efficacy, mistrust in medicine, vaccine science, right? Talk about polio, like the first vaccine. What was it? It might have been smallpox. Anyways, Indigenous health, colonization. You can talk about rural health, cultural competency, sterilizations, residential schools and trauma. Again, the social determinants of health. 6 more. Let's go. I'm giving y'all so much. It's Christmas. It's Christmas in February. Housing. You can talk about the housing crisis, international investments, vacancy tax. Huge in Ontario. Huge problem. Homelessness, economy, and immigration. You talk about international medical graduates, retraining, residency spots, the unmatched rate for Canadian medical graduates, language, multiculturalism, and standards of care. So multiculturalism meaning like, yo, you might have like a physician coming from Asia, and you know they're probably going to be better equipped to address like an Asian immigrant's health needs, because they understand, you know, maybe they're from China and they're like, oh, you know, I understand how you view things compared to someone who grew up in Ottawa, for instance, right? So there's benefits and concerns. Standard of care, right? There are different medical schools across the world. You know, are we being taught at the same level to provide the same standard of care? The doctor shortage. You can talk about international medical graduates. So again, for the person in the chat, unique. Look, we're talking. These are hitting each other, right? Maybe you never researched doctor shortage at all, right? I hope you did, but maybe you didn't. You could be asked about the doctor shortage, and you could talk about. You might not have like researched it too well, but you can talk about IMGs because you researched that. You could talk about tele ICUs and rural health because you researched that, right? We have a where is it? Telehealth question bank, right? So you can think on your feet, and once you have like 80% of these topics down, you're going to be able to make connections. Like, oh, okay, maybe I didn't study this, but you know, it actually relates to these 3 or 4 other ideas. Because these aren't just isolated issues. Everything's connected. Aging population, the tax system, ageism, telehealth, loneliness problems. The tax system meaning like we have less working age individuals in Canada and more elderly population. So we're going to have to pay, you know, for their social services one way or another, right? Their medical care, it's going to be very expensive. And you have a smaller population paying tax. So how are you going to fund that, right? Maybe through immigration. Wealth transfer, medical assistance dying, resource allocation, quality of life, AI in healthcare. So I guess you guys are lucky to be with me because I've been in tech. You can talk about obviously bias. This is like you go to CBC Health. I'm not against CBC Health. I just use it as an example. It's going to say, oh, you know, you got to make sure your AI is not biased. Oh, you know, okay, cool. That's right. That's true. But everybody else is saying that. What about talking about natural language processing and applying it to electronic health records? What about talking about data security, right? So many health systems in Toronto, I think a few in Toronto at least last summer, were completely paralyzed. They were paralyzed by a ransomware attack, right? So, and I'm at the Mayo Clinic right now, the #1 hospital in the world, and I've talked to the IT department. They're saying every single day there's like 6 to like dozens of attacks on the healthcare, on the hospital, trying to like steal their medical records, right? Because imagine if you can steal people's genomes. I mean, like, what could you even do with that? I don't even want to know. So genomes, you can use AI, apply it to like genomics, find variants that are pathogenic, quantum computing. I mean, there's like so much cool stuff. And I urge you, please don't be boring. Please don't be like healthcare GPT. Please have some cool opinions and it'll serve you well. And genomes, personalized medicine, designer babies, curing disease, diagnosis and accuracy, and reinforcing bias. So cool ideas there. And now let's go to the last section, pro tips. Kayan asks, should I put more emphasis on studying for interviews after completing my application or at the same time as studying for the MCAT? So Kayan, I'm guessing you have not received your interview yet, but I would fully study for the MCAT and not even think about your interview until you're done the MCAT and you've applied. And I started studying like a little bit, like reading and getting in the mindset of things before I even got interviews, but it was well after my CASPER, it was well after everything. Okay, yeah, I understand. Yeah, don't think about interviews until your MCAT's done. Please focus on that. All right. Organization, pro tips. So this is about letting your amazing answers get the recognition they deserve. And I always have a sentence like, if you're asked about something in your panel, hello, first I'll address the pros and cons of implementing such a health policy before giving my opinion and then relating it to an experience I've had in the area. So always, give a sentence, at least organize your ideas so even you don't go on tangents. Avoid extreme stances. People think this is so obvious. People think, oh, Kevin, why are you telling me this? I'm not an idiot. Okay, let's look at this question. Should pharmaceutical companies be allowed to provide gifts, such as free samples of their latest medicinal compounds, to physicians? I guarantee you 99% of people are like, no, this is a conflict of interest. Oh no, pharmaceutical companies, those are bad people, right? You have these like biases, obviously, and you're probably right. I mean, it is a conflict of interest. You're not wrong, but here's the thing. Ontario, we have Medicare, which means healthcare is free at point of service, but we don't have pharmacare. So drugs, medicines are not free. If you want antibiotics, you're going to have to pay for them. Or maybe you're going to use your parents' insurance or your own insurance, right? Or maybe some government program. But the thing is, what if you have patients that can't afford some very expensive medications that they need for their chronic conditions or something? Maybe it's a life-saving drug. They can't afford it. And this company is going to give you free samples for free. Boom, now you can give it to your patient. Now you serve them. Furthermore, what if it's like a compound that is actually you never thought about, or you didn't know about, and it's actually going to really help in the treatment of some patients that you have? And because of some law that prevents this, you're not going to be able to even know about it. Or what about this pharmaceutical company? Now they can't market, so they go bankrupt. Maybe it was a huge part of the local economy, right? We have like Sanofi Pasteur in Toronto. That's a big part of the local economy, especially in North York. And now a lot of people are going to be unemployed. They're going to be laid off. They can't feed their families, and so on. So even if someone sounds super evil, please give it some thought and delve into what is their perspective. And that will show your maturity in a sea of applicants who are just going to be like, no, this is a conflict of interest. I read this in my book. Oh, conflict of interest. Oh, non-maleficence. Justice. Whatever. Anyways. Study at night. So when I was a teenager, I read this book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens. And it said what you do 45 minutes before you go to bed gets replayed in your brain up to 6 times more than anything else you did in the day. And I don't know how true the number 6, 6 times more is, but I believe it because if you go watch the news before you go to bed and it's like, oh, this person got shot, this person got murdered, there was a robbery here, you're going to have bad sleep. If you watch a horror movie before you go to bed, you're going to have nightmares. If you watch in the morning, I would not have nightmares. If I watch a horror movie at like 7 a.m. Now, what I would do is I would always practice for my interviews, my panels, right before I went to bed and like leading up to that. So like from 7 p.m. to like 11 p.m. No, I'm not hanging out with you. No, I'm gonna go on a date with you in 2 months. Don't bother me. So I would reserve that nighttime so these personal stories would become ingrained in my way of thinking. And the perspective taking mindset would become a part of my way of thinking and not something I just memorized for my interview day. Also, whereas everybody was just, reading the same stuff, I would look into Nature, Biotechnology, MIT Tech Review, Stanford Future Everything podcast, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Wired magazine. There's so many cool things. I just started, especially at the gym. I put on like an economics podcast, a finance podcast. Who's doing that? No one. No one. And I was able to provide so many cool opinions that other people weren't able to. Now, share videos of your answers with colleagues because this is a virtual interview. What I would do is you go on our website. We have our medical school MMI and just interview question bank, which is also for traditional interviews like your panel. And you can practice, having 30 seconds to read a question so you can think on your feet and answering in a minute. Begin. How do you think advances in technology and data analysis are changing the way that medicine is practiced? Right? And you have time to think, or you can make it shorter. And you can see, what is my presence on camera like? Am I looking at the camera? Am I using my hands too much? Am I, saying ums and ahs? And you can review your footage. You can send it to your friends. And then again, you have those expert example answers to look at with ideas to go beyond. And, so many categories, especially for your panels. Describe a time you showed empathy. This is huge for your panels. Like this category right here, I would filter down to the personal questions, the behavioral questions, right? And I'd spend a lot of time on that. And lastly, practice, practice, practice. So there's a lot of topics to not only have information on, but be able to provide an expert opinion on, okay? So again, I want to highlight our main question bank has like a health policy section, but we also have Ontario health policy, other provinces, Quebec, opioid crisis, AI and health, American health policy. This is huge. Why is this huge? So in my interviews, I'd be asked a question about, okay, like what should Ontario do or whatever? What should the city of Ottawa do? And then I'd be like, because I did an exchange in the US, I'd be like, okay, this is like the current state of thinking in Canadian thinking. But here's what the US is doing. In fact, like we've seen this done actually here in the US, in this state. Or this is what the Bismarck system in Germany is doing. Or this is what the NHS in England is doing. This is what Singapore is doing. And I would have knowledge of other healthcare systems which would substantiate my answers and make them like so powerful and compelling compared to anybody else. Like, some people are giving GPT answers that they read on like some Canadian news website. Cool. That's a great answer, but you need to stand out. And it would get to the point where like I'm teaching my interviewer in my answer. They're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And that is like the coolest thing in your interview to stand out. So learn about other health systems in other countries. Alberta, telehealth, alternative medicine. Again, other provinces in Canada, definitely know that. Genetic testing, CRISPR, genome editing, vaccine ethics, mental health, and so on, okay? And we're going to give you a subscription credit to our platform, a very good one, right after this webinar. It's going to come with the slides, so be on the lookout for that. And that is it. As promised, under an hour. Are there any questions?